Well, hello, everyone out there. We are here with Kubernetes by Example Insider. I'm Langdon White, your host, and I am a professor over at Boston University. And for this episode, this is actually our 24th episode. So we decided that it was our 2-year anniversary, even though it's actually been slightly more. So we decided that we would do a little bit of a recap of, some of the episodes we've done in the past, as well as kind of what we're doing with the show and how it's evolved and that kind of stuff. If you haven't seen it, we actually did an episode called Episode 0, where we introduced the show and what we were about and why we were doing it at all, way back. And we'll drop the link in the chat so you can check it out if you want to. But long story short, I'd like to welcome at least, is this all the co-hosts? This might be all of our co-hosts that we've had. Well, not anymore. So early on, we also had Chris Short as a co-host, and I'm trying to think if there's anybody else. But most of the ones that we've been who've been on the show in the past year or so are all here today, and so I will round robin to have them introduce themselves. And because he's in the top left of my screen, Josh Wood, sorry, why don't you go first?
Fortunately, I'm in the top left of my screen arrangement too, Langdon, so I was expecting that I might get called on first. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the 24th edition of KBE Insiders. My name is Josh Wood. I am a developer advocate at Red Hat. I focus a lot on OpenShift, but especially community efforts in the open source realm that surround it, extend it, and add new features and kind of focus on the future direction that we see in the industrial orchestration platforms like Kubernetes. I've hosted, I think, 3 or 4 episodes of this show over the last couple of years. I have some good memories of that. We've talked about some neat topics with some folks outside of the company and involved in projects that we're all involved in together. This is a great opportunity to do that.
All right, so let's keep it in the Joshes. And Josh Burkest, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, other Josh Burkest, which is why we have not hosted a show. I have not hosted a show with Josh Wood because that would be too confusing. I'm in the Red Hat Open Source Program Office, where I help Red Hat steward its contributions to Kubernetes. I started with Red Hat 7 years ago, actually, because I was already working on Kubernetes at the time, which is like, I think that was before 1.0, but early days. And I joined the KBE team to help them find guests to interview from the Kubernetes community. Savita, you want to go ahead?
Oh, sure. Thank you. Thank you, Josh. Hi, everyone. My name is Savita Raghunathan. I am a senior software engineer at Red Hat, focusing on application modernization. And I'm also a maintainer of the Conveyor project, which ties into the application modernization efforts. But my heart lies in the Kubernetes community. I am a contributor to Kubernetes community. That's where I met many of the folks, including Josh Burkest. And it has provided me with the opportunity to be here. And I am looking forward to meeting more new folks.
Nice. Daniel, I think you're last but not least.
Yeah, sure. Hi, my name is Daniel. I'm a developer advocate like Josh, and then a little bit different business unit, but pretty much focused on like a normal Java developers. And then I also like some hosted some of the couple of shows for the past years, and which allows me a lot of opportunity to meet people like a super awesome like a Kubernetes ecosystem people, but also it's a really good chance for me to learn something new because I've been using Kubernetes for many years, and then I spend a lot of time bringing more business application into Kubernetes for developer standpoint, how to make it easier, how to make it fast, and how to make it useful. And then sometimes I really be just tie into very small area, but whenever I joined this Kube Example and KBE Insider, a lot of awesome guest speaker, and then just let me know, yeah, this is a better way. This is maybe something new. So that's I really thankful and then still be here.
Nice. So, like I said, we're kind of doing a little bit of a recap show. And so one of the things I kind of first want to talk about is to see kind of if we're all on the same page. And so I was going to kind of ask, what do you think this most salient kind of component of the show is? Like, what's the most, kind of differentiator or whatever that you think is why people would want to come and watch the live stream? And I would say, raise your hand if you want to go first, or just kind of jump in rather than calling on you and putting you on the spot. All right, Josh, go ahead.
So something that makes me think of immediately, and actually calls back to something Daniel mentioned in introducing himself, which is, so at a general level and for all topics, I think this show has helped me stay on top of trends that are coming down the road. And I think right now, the key trend that I see in this community is that effort around making things simpler for developers to actually deploy things on what we might refer to in a general way as modern infrastructure. So OpenShift, Kubernetes, container-oriented orchestration on cloud services, and all the different places we see that running. And the last, say DevOps has been a 10 or 15-year cultural initiative that's changed a lot of the ways that folks work inside of companies and has joined the concerns of development and operational teams in new ways that there was kind of a wall between them in the past. There's a lot of advantages that come out of that. And then kind of corollary to that is some of the kind of SRE or site reliability engineering stuff that comes out of Google's practices and how we run this infrastructure. All of those things are really cool. They make our apps more robust in production. They make them easier to upgrade and release, but they also dramatically proliferated the concerns for the daily developer, the regular lady or fellow writing Java and living inside of that application, adding features and bug fixes to it all the time. Where 5 years ago, I might have been worried each day mostly about my IDE and my compiler. I build something, I kind of throw it over the wall, and I know someone else will take care of deploying it. Now I have all this YAML to describe how a deployment works, how we route traffic into that cluster once I get it deployed, how the automated pipeline that builds my thing works. And all of those, they're really tremendous features that have brought a lot of cool advantages to the organizations that employ them, but they've increased the load on individual developers. So being in the community and keeping track of efforts around abstracting away some of that proliferation. And immediately something that's been a hot topic around the community lately that comes to mind, like Backstage out of Spotify. It's not directly Kubernetes related. Kubernetes is a major deployment target for that, but it's really about tying together all of these disparate services and maybe lightening that load of YAML that doesn't have anything to do with the application you're trying to work on, but is all of the application's deployment concerns. And so that's just one example of kind of that trend I see around projects in the wider community that are oriented not necessarily in the central engineering core of the infrastructure, but are are about improving that user experience and deproliferating some of that complexity that these initiatives over the last decade or decade and a half have brought into the daily life of your average developer.
Well, I wanted to try quickly clarify one thing there is like, it's not just like there's certainly a little bit more workload, but it's also the cognitive load, right? It's really the like how many different things you kind of have to keep in your brain all at the same time.
Right. All these new words.
I think that's really what kind of adds to that complexity, right? Rather than literal work.
Right.
Sorry, Josh, go ahead, Burkus.
Oh, I was just going to say, one of the things that I've thought about with Kubernetes is that YAML may have been a mistake, but not for the reasons that people talk about it being a mistake. It may have actually been a mistake because it was too easy, right? Because the YAML was never meant to be the UI, right? The assumption was that people were going to go ahead and build tools that would write the YAML for you. But I think the problem is that the YAML was just easy enough to write that people were really slow to build those tools, right? If it had been XML or syntactical, JSON, HTML, something like that, something that really required a lot of sort of annoying punctuation, people might have been a lot faster to actually build tools to write it for them.
See, I was going to say that
yeah.
some people here definitely, and some people listening to the show may remember that exact same assumption about XML, which also took forever to get any tools, because it was like, yes, it's harder to write than YAML, sure, but it's still pretty easy to write. And so as a result, you ended up with a lot of handwritten XML, doing kind of service-oriented architecture type stuff, or, portal-y stuff, or whatever. And I think you're exactly right. I think that's a little bit of the problem, with, kind of these markup language models for doing
because
configuration.
If you're able to write it by hand, you will by definition drift farther and farther away from conventionalization or from standard ways of doing things. Like, one of the great things about stamping this stuff out with tooling is that you sort of get you are creating and enforcing a standard or a convention around how you do things in the boilerplate parts and the parts that get repeated between multiple YAML files. If they're written by hand, that convention is necessarily going to drift farther away. I mean, just as one outcropping of kind of having these markup style configuration languages that are very easy to get your fingers inside of.
Yeah, one of the things I read not that long ago, within the last couple of years, but I thought it was really interesting, is that that people who tend to use IDEs tend to be working in languages that are more established, and people who are more on the text editor side, like VI, Emacs, whatever, tend to be in languages that are more, they're more dynamic, they're changing more, right? Because an IDE, when you have a brand new language, can't actually bring very much to the table, right? Because it's not standardized enough or whatever. And I kind of wonder, to some extent, why, if especially like YAML with Kubernetes, the dynamism of how fast it's been changing also makes the tooling hard. So I think, to Burke's point, right, you have both the easy to write or easy feeling at the first, right? It's like writing Perl code. It's really easy to write the first draft, and then all of a sudden 2 months later you're like, oh my God, what did I do? Right. And then, but you also have the problem of the IDEs can't really, are having a hard time keeping up, because you have, a new custom resource definition every, 6 hours.
Right. And it's something we saw, and this is the funny thing, is that, like, people like me who are infrastructure people, right? Because ultimately what happened was that Kubernetes got built by infrastructure people. And this is why we're only now sort of really having folks focus on, hey, let's make things easier for application developers. Because the problem is, well, even as infrastructure people, you start with the idea of making things easier for application developers. But since you are not an application developer, your idea of making things easy is not necessarily their idea of making things easy. And as a result, you also end up with a lot of the command line stuff, right? I worked on Postgres for years, and the primary Postgres UI was always, and still is, the extended SQL command line. There are still things you can do on that command line that you can't do with any other interface. Some of it you looked at, like, I don't know if you saw some of the early Kelsey Hightower demonstrations of Kubernetes and showing people how to use Kubernetes. And he even went more direct, where he just inserted JSON directly into etcd, which you can totally do. It actually works as long as you don't mess it up, right?
As long as you're perfect,
you mess it up, you can bring down your whole cluster, right? But anyway, one of the things we tried to bring people with this show is to bring in people who talk about these sorts of things, right? As in, where are we going with Kubernetes? What's sort of the next step? What's the next step, not just in Kubernetes, but also in cloud, right? Are there other things, that sort of thing? We've looked at some stuff like eBPF and WASM and other technologies that either might replace Kubernetes for some people, or might be the next layer on top of Kubernetes, right? Serverless, that sort of thing. And so to really sort of give people an idea, this is why it's Insider, to give people an idea of where we might be going. Because we're not done sort of building this thing
All right, I'm gonna call on Savita. What do you think?
Yeah.
You know, and we're focused, I think, a little inwardly, which is I don't think it's a bad thing, but like, you know, kind of what is it that you find interesting about kind of, you know, being on the show or interviewing people or, you know, watching the show?
So, for all the reasons that both Josh has mentioned, and for me, there is also another thing that there is this show brings people together. I see the way that I see is that we connect people together when we interview insiders. I mean, when we interview people who are Kubernetes insiders or like um, the people who are maintainers, contributors of the new technologies like WhatsApp and whatnot, you get to understand how the community is, and gives an opportunity for people who are listening to the show on how to get started, onboard it, contribute, and grow the community in ways, you know, like make it sustainable. So for me, the connection that puts the show apart, you know.
Cool. Yeah, no, I don't disagree. I mean, you know, it's right there in the word, which, you know, people kind of gloss over a lot, right? But community, right? You know, open source projects, they largely they work because there's communities and, you know, sub communities and all that other stuff. And you know, communities require a lot of effort to maintain and grow and all that jazz. You know, Kubernetes is one example, but we have lots of open source projects like that. But we, like, even here at BU, right? Like, we have a community of instructors who help us teach classes. Like, we you know, get people from industry to come and help teach some of the classes. But we want to build a community there so that they can kind of learn from each other, because the experience of an industry pro becoming a teacher is not the same experience as somebody who went to undergrad and then went and got their PhD and then became a teacher. And so, you know, giving them, you know, kind of like-minded people helps, you know, with the key differences about the things that they already learned in industry that maybe you know, a more traditionally taught teacher didn't, and vice versa. So I think that's been really interesting. But it's a lot of work to maintain it. You got to build relationships. You got to, you know, try to convince them that there's stuff to do when you're not in the meeting, you know, things like that. And I think communities are really hard, and I think that's really, really important. So I really strongly agree with you, Savita, that the, you know, trying to build those connections and recognizing that there are people in your community who are driving the bus and paying attention to what's going on with that really can make a big difference. All right, so Daniel, I think you're last. We're turning to you. What do you feel like is the kind of biggest driver for you for KBE Insider?
Yeah, so I just a little bit thinking about that, why you guys actually talked about it. I pretty much agree with the Josh and Savita and another Josh thought as well. But in my case, so why people actually want to come to the show again is pretty much the guest speaker, and then they actually share their own experience rather than just presenting their own great Chinese feature. Everybody actually can go to some conference in person or virtual YouTube channel. They can find, oh, this is a new cool feature, but they cannot find what is people like a failure or some use cases or the real experience. How do that new technology and community help their daily job, just like Josh said. So for example, we already showed like a new trend and technology. For example, WASM and then like a eBPF is a really buzzword, and even like AI ML stuff. And then everybody's talking about same thing. Okay, this is a really cool product or technology. You should use that. But people really wondering, if I adapt to that technology, how to make my life easier and then better. I don't want to spend my time after 6 p.m. I don't want to be bothered or something else. And then our show actually showed that real story. Okay. And then our show actually share, okay, why this matter? And then why this technology was born to figure out this kind of stuff. So people actually have some desire to understand that and figure it out that. So that's why people coming to our show and are really willing to revisit again. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, and I want to just like second or add to that a little bit, because that at one level of listener or audience member, like folks who are already in the daily practice or working in a tech job somewhere doing development, there's that sort of information. That's a really practical kind of case studied information from the folks who have been guests and guest speakers on the show, as opposed, like Daniel is saying, to a flashy demo that you might do at a conference. You might actually talk about implementation failures and complications and ways where project X and project Y didn't initially work really well together. And then it's sort of a level even more of a beginner than that. One of my favorite parts of the segments that I've watched and that I've been involved in co-hosting is we'll have somebody who is maybe a co-founder at a startup, or a group leader inside the Kubernetes community, or a project leader on some other open source project. And we'll get to hear their story about not just why that project started, but how they began in open source. And how, like, what were the first projects they worked on? What kinds of things did they do in those projects? I mean, I remember some guests talking about, like, really early on, I was always looking for documentation bugs to fix. And that was one of the ways that I got PRs moving up a channel and got to know some folks in the community. And that led to other projects I worked on, and more like kind of coding oriented things. So I think that kind of instruction for folks who might be really early in the path on kind of exploring open sources, not just how do you participate, but even how do you find the communities beyond this show and get into those communities, because that community is such an important support structure if you're going to employ technologies that are generated by and coming out of those communities. So I think that's almost a twofold function that Daniel alluded to, and hopefully I usefully expanded on a little bit. There's like,
Absolutely.
you get business information, how to use the stuff, and also some career and community insight. How do you find folks? How do you start working on an open source project, improving something that you yourself are using?
Yeah, that's exactly what I ask a lot when I go to some conference area, like a booth area. When I met a lot of university and college students, they're actually looking for okay, where I can find some of the more valuable information to get better job after graduation. So yeah, you should go to there, and then there are tons of the information. Even if you see CNCF landscape, there are thousands of projects. So it's too many projects. Which one I need to choose? That's why people need to find some inspiration and insightful information rather than just normal knowledge.
Yeah, so I kind of want to jump in there because Josh, you stole my comment, which was, one of the things I really like about the show is we ask two questions of every guest that comes on, right? What got you into open source, and what got you into Kubernetes? And exactly to your point, I think it's really important about kind of showing an example of how you can more get involved in open source by looking at these people who are successful in open source and kind of how did they get to that point. That's, I think, a hugely useful thing to know. The other thing that's kind of to both your points a little bit that I think is really useful at the show is, coming from the developer side of the house, right? One of the things that is always terrifying about open source is betting on the right horse. And so if you often will have multiple technology options for how to approach a particular problem. And when it's open source, you're not always sure which one is going to continue, right? So what I think is really useful about the show is that, talking about like eBPF and WASM in particular, given the number of people that we've interviewed about it, given the number of people we've talked to about it, you can make a pretty good bet that WASM and eBPF are going to continue. They're going to be important. And so making an investment, I think, Daniel, you said, kind of after hours or whatever, in kind of learning those technologies is probably a good one. Whereas, some other tool chain, and for me, one of the big ones where I got burned really badly and still think it was a great piece of technology was Spring Batch way back in the day. And I spent a lot of time and energy. I centered an application around it, et cetera. And then it just kind of died. At least as far as I can tell. I don't know, maybe it's come back, and it's since I was really playing a lot in Spring. But it was just kind of like there was, it had all this promise, but what I didn't have a connection to really was a strong connection to the Spring community to find out if there was a lot of people behind it. I just kind of had the docs, or the website or whatever. And so I think that's one of the things that's really valuable about the show and something I hope we're bringing to our audience. I feel like I just closed the show, but all right. So let's see. Should we could try talking about actually I like one of the other questions we kind of genned up beforehand. Can y'all comment on, like, one of the things we try very hard to do is to get guests from really disparate backgrounds as well as disparate kind of projects that they work on. I'm kind of curious about your perspectives on why is that a good thing, or do you think it doesn't much matter? And I know the question's a little biased, and I'm pretty confident I know all of your answers that it's more on the good side, but feel free to kind of weigh in. All right, who are we going to make go first? How about Savita? You're up.
So I'm going to summarize it one more time before I answer it. So the question is that why we are bringing the guests from the diverse background. Can you just
right. So like, I think we work really hard to go and find guests who are coming from diverse backgrounds. So they kind of got into the space from diverse places, right? But then also a diversity amongst the kind of things they're working on, because we do, we interview people who are, release managers. We interview people who contribute to docs. We had somebody who built one of the, certification, exams, as well as things that are a little more obvious, right? Like eBPF and WASM, et cetera. And so the question is just kind of like, why does that help the audience when we work on that problem?
So thank you for clarifying. For me personally, right, before I became a co-host in rotating co-host bench in this show, I was a guest. And before that, there were like 4 episodes, and I was the 5th one. I was on the 5th one. So when I looked at the show, the first thing I noticed was like if there was like diversity in the show. And yes. And one of the reasons is that when I started after my grad school, there was lack of diversity around me. So there was no, it was hard to figure out, like I couldn't find a mentor and I couldn't find my place, right? I couldn't find the ways in which I could grow. I moved from India to here, so new place, new culture, new community and everything. Until I found Kubernetes community. So that's one of the other reasons it's like super close to my heart. Like there I saw so many diverse folks and so many folks who are like me, who are different, who are like pushing and making things better. And they all have like one common goal. And some of the learnings that I've taken from that place, and then I try to make that happen in Conveyor too, like make it a warm and welcoming place for everyone. So that's one of the reasons that I feel like the diversity in speakers is really, really important, that it gives someone to look forward to. Like you can reach out to the speakers later if you want to learn from them, or they can be your mentor if they have time for that. Of course, but you can still learn from their experiences, and you can follow them along if you want, and grow from there. So that is one important thing for me. And another thing is that we have already discussed in depth, like how it is beneficial that we talk about other technologies which are related to Kubernetes, which might replace Kubernetes or which can add on top of Kubernetes. I think that is really important to stay in this cloud native world, because everything moves so fast, and like I cannot keep up. And I think like Daniel said, there are like thousands of projects in the landscape. So need to know like which is important, or which the industry is picking up next, or like what is at the end of the day, one thing is like about open source. Another thing is also like you work on a product that pays you, or like the employer, like you have to make money. The employer has to make money to pay you, and sometimes you need to pick out the right thing. And I feel like these little projects and the directions can provide insights into what would be the next hit, and that can actually tie into the roadmap and vision of your product that you're working on at your workplace.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with all that. I think I think it's really important that we try to make sure that people can kind of see themselves in the work, right? You can see yourself in the show, and so I think that's a really big aspect. And then I think as we've been talking about, right, it's also really important to get kind of the whole spectrum, so that any individual doesn't have to try to keep track of the whole spectrum, right? So, all right, who else wants to answer that question? What else do you think?
Well, I certainly think, I mean, I agree that there's a definite important function in kind of publicizing the diversity that does exist in the Kubernetes community. I mean, we've just heard from someone who said it helped them feel like they might have a place in that community when finding that place was not initially a really easy thing. So I think with the show, helping to illustrate that diversity by talking to folks from across that community who are both socioeconomically and sort of that dimension of diversity that we think about very commonly, but also like experientially diverse. What have they worked on? What's important to them? One of the things I'm always trying to do is get daily developer types involved in these upstream communities for exactly like a reason we've already touched on in other ways from another angle, which is if you don't have folks who like their main concern is writing Java or writing Python every day, then the whole community and the projects it spurs are all kind of dominated by infrastructure systems thinkers. And that gets you a distributed system of a certain kind of predictable pattern and picture that doesn't necessarily handle the concerns of folks who are doing the daily application development work, who are doing maybe security and compliance type work. So in addition to like what we would call maybe traditional diversity, which is really important, and I think we're good at showing that diversity across the community as we interview different guests. We're also, I think, trying to engender a real viewpoint diversity and like the experiences and kind of the engineering mindsets and practices that each of these different groups bring into the upstream projects. Because fundamentally, if Kubernetes remains something that like if you've been around distributed systems or HPC or systems thinking in general, you look at it, oh wow, it's really cool. There's so many patterns I recognize that are very exciting to me there. While failing to serve the actual most important audience, which is the folks who create the applications that get deployed there. Because the large, pretty distributed systems I've spent a lot of my career working on don't really do anything that human beings care about until application developers run code on them, right? They're like an operating system kernel, right?
Right. So speaking of people with an application development background, Daniel.
Yep. So so diversity is always super important thing, and not only like some find speakers, but also like some looking at some specific topic. Also Kubernetes is already super mature stuff. Everybody is doing Kubernetes, even if everybody don't know what Kubernetes is. But the Kubernetes is like a de facto. Everybody needs to do that. If you do not, it's something kind of you behind some history. The thing is, I'm more looking into like an ecosystem on the Kubernetes, which is just some kind of make me like a more some new diversity approach. It's not only speaker, but also relevant to technologies. So some speakers should come from end user perspective. And then some guest speaker should come from like a more founder of their technologies. Because like just Josh said, that like a daily life, okay, I'm just 20 years Java developer, but not super awesome developer, just like a normal guy. I just spend like 6 or 7 hours at home and then just develop my business logic and Java. And then my challenge is I need to make some new observability on my application, but the application should be running on Kubernetes. And then I don't want to use old technology. And how do I do that? And then that is my mission challenge for the next 2 weeks. And then maybe go to like some KBE. There are some guy actually talk about how to make it better your application have observability using OpenTelemetry, which is the second largest commitment in the CNCF projects. And then, but I don't want to listen, this is an awesome project and this is a new feature and how to instrument, what is the SDK. I pretty much more focus on, okay, how to integrate this new great community project into my actual application with some example, sample, and practices, and what is some kind of troubleshooting practices, something like that. That's why we also looking forward to find some people from many different perspectives, like end user and the developers, the platform engineer, even some stuff like some like a rock star speakers as well. Yeah, that's I'm really that's my thought actually for the diversity and then find them speaker and then our upcoming topics as well.
So I couldn't agree with this more. Speaking as a strong development background, right? And then I spent a bunch of years at Red Hat, which is a bunch of infrastructure people, right? There are a lot of them, right? And shameless plug, right? This is actually why we have recently started this. It's kind of like on the bubble of whether it's a working group or it's like part of a working group or whatever, but about trying to do a curriculum for higher ed around what we call cloud native development, right? So, if you go and look at most of the documentation, the training, the certifications, all that stuff that's around Kubernetes, most of it is about how to make Kubernetes go, right? Which is good. But it doesn't really give much to the application developer about like, what does it mean to build cloud native applications? Like, what is event-driven architecture? Why do I want to build things such that or like, what do I have to change about how I build things such that they live natively in places like Kubernetes? And so, like I said, shameless plug, we're hoping to maybe do a meetup actually at KubeCon, but we're starting to try to put together some materials and really not focus on how to make whatever thing go, and instead focus on what changes in your application architecture do you need to make to be truly cloud native applications, because they're the only ones that are really going to be able to tolerate the environment that Kubernetes provides. So yeah, like I said, I'm wholeheartedly in agreement. But I think that, it's kind of getting back to the original question, I think that's the key, right? Is that the diversity is how we provide, software, probably lots of other things too, but I've only really worked in software, is how we provide software that actually meets most people's needs. It'll never meet everyone's needs, but unless we're going and looking at perspectives from, kind of different, socioeconomic backgrounds, different experience levels, different goals, right? Infrastructure people versus application engineers, if we're not kind of bringing everybody into the house, we're not going to build as good software as we will if we do. So I think that's a huge benefit for it.
Yeah, an example I can readily give that I know Burkus could speak on for hours is we built Kubernetes for years without ever talking to any database people.
Exactly.
So
it's not. I'm going to say that's not true. I was involved very early on. I was involved very early on. Why do you think we have stateful set?
Well, I mean, to be honest, though, the part of the problem with things like Kubernetes, right? But is that, it's not solving a new problem, right? Like at all, right? It's trying to universally solve it for a kind of across a bunch of environments. The thing is that things like databases in particular, right, have actually solved this problem, most of the problems that Kubernetes is trying to solve for a long time, and does it very, very well, right? They're very good at horizontal scaling. They're very good at being modified to do vertical scaling, if that's your preference. They do it well. And so kind of getting in the mix of it.
Wait, what databases were you using?
So I would say, between, so it's not trivial to set it up, but, I would say, like, I think Postgres scales much better as kind of a single instance with, or replicas or whatever, then it kind of like, I think Kubernetes kind of gets in the way until you do things like, as you say, like stateful sets, like its kind of core design kind of doesn't let a database do what it does well. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm explaining that.
Yeah, because you have applications that have their own notions of clustering, is the way I have always sort of talked about.
Right.
And databases are the kind of canonical example. There's also kind of distributed file systems that had done a lot of advanced work down kind of their own paths on this that were outside of Kubernetes techniques. And that proved difficult to adapt to that Kubernetes API interface. That's a lot of what the original inspiration behind the operators pattern and concept was really about. How do we map Postgres' notion of what a cluster is to Kubernetes' notion of what a cluster is?
I think Burke is just really close to Postgres, and so therefore it only sees its flaws.
And database technology in general. I found that really amusing, because the whole reason I got involved with Kubernetes to begin with was I was trying to automate Postgres failover. Because there was no way to do that natively with Postgres tools. Right? Like, you could actually make the failover happen and it worked really well, but a human being had to trigger it. And, as you started down the road of multiple steps of automation until we ended up on Kubernetes, because the problem is you get, okay, well, we're going to have, a watchdog and a script somewhere, but where does that watchdog live? What happens if the watchdog fails? Getting all the way down that, and you end up with, oh, hey, I'm now deploying Postgres in a Kubernetes cluster. And I do think, actually, weirdly, I think that Kubernetes ended up solving problems, believe it or not, for databases before it really solved them for things like Java application development. For the simple reason that in order to make Kubernetes work, the community attracted a lot of infrastructure people.
Right.
And they and those infrastructure people built things, but there's a huge overlap between database people and sort of general systems infrastructure people. There's not as much a huge overlap between infrastructure people and people, for example, who build application front ends.
Right. Well, but I think Java's a great example there, where Java also had a similar problem, right? Because Java has this, robust model for doing, this virtual machine thing, right? Where it's meant and designed to be kind of like clustered, right? It's a big iron component, and then you run all your little applications in it. So when you came along and said, oh yeah, we're going to kill your big iron virtual machine, every 10 seconds, then something like Quarkus had to come along, right? Because it's just like fundamentally at odds with the design of how like Java works, right? You have these application servers, and arguably C# back in the days of like MTS and that kind of stuff has similar problems, because they're designed for long runtime, right? And then you have the applications that kind of come and go, because they were trying to solve the same problem that Kubernetes is trying to solve. I think it's interesting, right? Is that, basically if you have a technology that's actually solving a problem pretty well, sometimes when a new technology comes along that's trying to solve it for everything, it actually is the least, it's kind of like cities, right? The inner city might be the first to get like cable television, but may take forever to get whatever the latest upgrade is, right? Because they went through the cost, effort, and everything else for that first run and took the hit, right? But they can't imagine going for the incremental improvement, because it's different.
That's a really cool example you just used there about cable television, because I live in an area of the country where that's very true about electricity. You really don't want to buy a house that is in a former fancy neighborhood that was one of the first places to get wired, because it still has that wiring, right? And in the time since, as the neighborhood grew around it, that stuff has newer wiring, and that is actually that same problem writ in physical terms that we see with adapting a former paradigm to like a more generalized newer API, kind of like we're talking about with clustered apps, and now I want to run them near, adjacent to, or on Kubernetes, and have some of these same kind of problems. Well, we wired the JVM and an application server, very successfully 20 years ago. So it still has all of those techniques, and it can prove harder to adapt to the latest edge of those techniques.
Yeah, I mean, not to go down that rat hole too much. I mean, so Boston, very much like my neighborhood, has this problem, right? Getting fiber laid when you already have cable lines is, kind of a daunting prospect, right? And and even getting power lines put underground, because, originally they just all went on towers, So it's kind of a similar problem if you have kind of a very advanced area early on. It actually sometimes has a hard time adopting the latest advancements. All right, so there was a rabbit hole. Hopefully all y'all don't have to worry about getting fiber or something. So let's kind of maybe move on from there a little bit. I have a very hard time answering this, but one of the other questions we came up with in advance was like, what was your favorite episode? I think for me, the only one I can kind of say as kind of sort of my favorite was 0. Like, I really liked that we went and did a show about why we're going to do the show. I thought that was a really good idea. I thought it worked really well. I thought it made it a lot clearer, especially for our early guests, about what the point was. And so I really like that. But since then, I don't know that I have, I think they've been really interesting. I found most of them interesting. Most of them, I didn't know a whole lot about the community. I found really interesting to talk to people. So I don't know. What about all y'all? Do you have a bias towards an episode or content?
I'm trying to bring up the list of old episodes.
Oh, gotcha.
So for me, I actually I loved all of them, but for me, it's just one of them actually around the Knative. I don't remember that the project name. What was that?
Yeah, which one was it? I'm looking right now.
The chain guard, the
delay.
He's the guy. Actually, we met in the KubeCon in Los Angeles I just left the KubeCon, and then we just bump up, and then he just, hey, so you love to Knative? Because I really spent a lot of time Knative project, and he turns out, I'm the founder, one of the founder of the Knative projects, and then after that we keep in touch with. And then, so I asked him, hey, so can you just come to our show and then really talk about the chain guard and the Knative stuff, why actually you invented this cool project? And then it was good. I mean, so I just wanted to say we can meet a lot of people in person and virtually. And then once we meet some people and then we have some relationship, and then we can actually ask them, hey, so I really want you to share your own experience and knowledge on our show. So that's my really good experience. I'm really I'm so grateful to be part of the KBE team, and then bring some people into the show, and then give some chance to share their own stuff so our random watchers and then our subscribers.
Yeah, I definitely do, have a bias towards like the serverless stuff as well, and but then again, event-driven architecture is kind of the name of my game. So yeah, that's an awesome story. I'm really glad that connection kind of got made and things were kind of moved from there. Any other episodes or topic areas that any of you like in particular? I know it's always hard to single anything out.
It is.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, I will. For simplicity's sake, I'll go ahead. I think this one will be short. Certainly for my personal hobby horses, I really enjoyed the episode on Civ, which is this kind of test harness framework for Kubernetes operators that Michael Gash, who's a pretty good friend of mine, and certainly a longtime acquaintance of mine from CoreOS days and forward. We haven't worked together at one company, but we've worked together on a number of different things. And I think that tech is fascinating. But in a immediate professional life kind of way, the episode that's pretty recent about Podman Desktop was really kind of one of the first stones in what has been a really popular series of efforts. So, and like I work on the dev advocates team, some of this has been work out of my team rather than by me directly, but Podman Desktop has been an extremely important topic and an extremely popular topic for us over the last 4 to 6 months. And I really kind of got my first exposure and any details about it and kind of started thinking about it and promoting it in importance in my own brain as a result of the episode here. And it, quick aside, Podman is a container runtime analogous to Docker and all of the other OCI container running engines. And Podman Desktop is a graphical user interface that makes it a lot easier to engage with the features of that container engine. And those things have been really popular, both for myself and some other folks on my team that have begun working really closely with the desktop project, promoting things they're doing, getting information about new features out there.
Yeah, +1 Podman Desktop. I've been using it for, I don't know, since it was created. Actually Podman in general, but the desktop less so, but somewhat. Yeah. So Savita, what about you?
For me, it was the SIG release episode with Sasha Grune. I hope I'm saying his last name correct. If I'm not, sorry. But that because I was part of a SIG, part of the SIG release. SIG release is one of the SIGs for Kubernetes upstream, and that is responsible for the 3 releases. We moved to 3 releases per year. They do more stuff, but there is a high level view. And I really liked the episode because I worked with Shasha for a while and I have interacted via Slack messages. But that was the first time that I got to talk to him in person, right? We work for the same company. He works for Red Hat as well, and I have interacted via Slack messages. But it felt like I got to know him in person, and I really enjoyed that. And it was a fun episode. I didn't know, I was like, would we be able to get to like the 50-60 minute mark of that episode? But I think we were like on time. We talked and talked, and it was really nice. So I enjoyed connecting with Sasha on that. I like other episodes, all other episodes too, but that was my personal favorite because I worked with someone and I got to know them really well.
All right, Burkus, what do you got? You think there's a particular episode that you can name?
Yeah, my favorite both to watch and to participate in was the special episode out of Detroit with driving around interviews.
Yeah. Those were a lot of fun. So I enjoyed doing them quite a lot, and so that's cool. I don't know if I have a link to that one.
Yeah, both from perspective of being in there and being in the Ford special electric vehicle, etc. And also, I kind of feel like the fact that you were driving around actually resulted in the guests being a little bit more free-ranging in what they talked about, right? That it even more than in a studio where they started following a thought to something else. And getting off and discussing sort of tangentially related things, some of which were quite fascinating.
Right. Yeah. No, I would agree. It was funny actually because one of the things we talked about in Amsterdam was actually doing like a canal, like on a boat or something. But I think it would have changed the dynamic a lot because I would then be looking at them and like interviewing them rather than kind of looking ahead at the road, right? Where they're just kind of talking about their subject area, right? And I'm kind of like poking a periodic question, not so much. It's really, I don't want to say it's a monologue as much as to say it's like, but it's a little, as you were kind of saying, it's more free ranging. I think because there's less pressure of questions and and somebody actually talking to you. I thought they came out really well. I'm putting the link in the chat as we speak.
Thanks for not taking me to the Canadian border. I didn't get my passport with me.
Yes. Right. Yes, that was a constant fear of because there's like this forced on-ramp where if you get on the on-ramp, you can't get out again until you're in Canada. And I didn't have my passport. Many of my guests didn't have their passports. So we were mildly concerned every time we go by.
Right. Insert Kubernetes analogy here. The
Yeah, that's a validating webhook, right? And they were,
yeah, right. Yeah.
So I wanted to take it back just a little bit. I realized that there's a topic that has come up in a whole bunch of shows that I found really interesting that hasn't actually had a show about it, which is Backstage. It even came up in this conversation, but I think Backstage showing up, I just thought, if you want to watch a whole bunch of old episodes, basically the course of this year, Backstage has come up almost in every episode. So that's been super interesting. Okay, so I think we are just about out of time. And so I wanted to thank all of you for being on the show today and reminiscing with us, but also for all the times that you've co-hosted with me. I really appreciate the support and your expertise and, kind of bringing a different perspective, as we were talking about earlier. If it's always just me, it's just my questions, right? It's just my opinions. And so I really appreciate the help with giving some different perspectives on the kinds of things we want to know. And then kind of related to that, in the background, helping us identify guests, helping us identify, some of our seed questions to try to have a good idea of what we want to talk about during the show. Really appreciate all that work, and I can't thank you enough. So thank you all. I'm going to give a little round of applause. Anybody else want to have any other kind of closing remarks, or should we kind of call it there? Many more episodes to come. All right.
We'll see.
Well, then, okay. Yeah. We'll see you all next time.
All right.
Thanks
Thank
very
you,
much,
guys.
everybody.
Yeah. Talk to you later.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.